Hello everyone. Welcome to tonight's story. Your likes and subscriptions can give me hope to create better stories. And let me know what changes you'd like me to make to my voice. Alright, now let's get to tonight's story. Chapter 1. The Morning Mist. Approximately 14,000 words. The first light of dawn crept slowly over the fjord, painting the sky in the softest shades of rose and gold. Astrid Eriksdotter stood at the threshold of her wooden home, breathing in the crisp mountain air that carried the scent of pine and wild heather. The morning mist clung to the valley below like a gentle embrace, swirling and dancing in patterns that seemed to tell ancient stories of the land. Astrid was known throughout her village as the herb gatherer, a woman whose knowledge of healing plants had been passed down through generations of wise women. Her grandmother had taught her the old ways, the gentle paths through the mountains where the most precious healing herbs grew in abundance. Today, like so many mornings before, she would make her peaceful journey into the misty peaks to gather what nature freely offered. She adjusted the woven basket on her back, its familiar weight a comfort against her shoulders. The basket had been crafted by her own hands from willow branches gathered by the river, each strand carefully selected and woven with the patience that mountain life had taught her. Inside, she had packed a small piece of rye bread, a flask of cool spring water, and soft linen cloths for wrapping the delicate herbs she would find. The path that led from her village into the mountains was worn smooth by countless generations of footsteps. It wound gently upward through groves of silver birch trees, their leaves whispering secrets in the morning breeze. As Astrid walked, she could hear the distant sound of water flowing over stones, a melody that had sung the people of her village to sleep for as long as anyone could remember. The air grew cooler as she climbed higher, and the mist grew thicker around her. It was not the heavy, oppressive fog of the lowlands, but rather a soft, silken veil that seemed to part gently before her steps and closed tenderly behind her. The mist carried with it the essence of the mountains, the clean, pure scent of snow-fed streams and ancient granite, of moss-covered stones and the first tender shoots of spring. Astrid paused at a familiar bend in the path where a small wooden marker carved with runic symbols indicated the way to the healing groves. The runes spoke of protection and safe passage, carved there by her great-grandfather who had first discovered these mountain paths. She traced the ancient symbols with her finger, feeling the smooth grooves worn by wind and weather, and whispered a quiet prayer of gratitude to the spirits of the mountain. As she continued her ascent, the trees began to change. The sturdy oaks and birches of the lower slopes gave way to hardy mountain pines, their dark green needles creating a soft carpet beneath her feet. The needles released their resinous fragrance with each step, a scent that spoke of endurance and quiet strength. Between the trees, she could see glimpses of the valley far below, now completely shrouded in a sea of white mist that looked like the softest wool. The sound of flowing water grew stronger, and soon Astrid came upon the first of the mountain streams that would guide her way. The water was crystal clear, so pure that she could see every pebble on the streambed. every grain of sand carried down from the high peaks. The stream bubbled and gurgled with quiet joy as it made its way over smooth stones, creating tiny waterfalls no taller than her hand, each one adding its voice to the mountain's gentle song. She knelt beside the stream and cupped the cold water in her hands, bringing it to her lips. The water was sweet and fresh, tasting of snow and stone and the deep, clean earth of the mountains. As she drank, she could feel the coolness spreading through her body, awakening her senses and preparing her for the peaceful work ahead. Following the stream upward, Astrid found herself entering a grove where the morning light filtered through the mist in golden shafts, illuminating patches of the softest moss she had ever seen. The moss covered everything here: the tree trunks, the fallen logs, the rounded stones that dotted the forest floor. It was moss of the deepest emerald green, so thick and luxurious that each step felt like walking on the finest carpet ever woven. In this magical grove, Astrid found the first of the herbs she sought. Growing in small clusters near the base of the moss-covered trees were plants that her grandmother had called Mountain's Blessing. Their small, heart-shaped leaves a silvery green that seemed to glow in the filtered light. These leaves, when dried and steeped in hot water, made a tea that could soothe the deepest cough and bring peace to troubled sleep. She moved with reverence and care, selecting only the healthiest plants and taking only what she needed, always leaving enough for the plants to flourish and regenerate. Each plant she harvested was wrapped carefully in soft linen and placed gently in her basket, with a whispered word of thanks to the earth that had nurtured it. The mist continued to swirl around her as she worked, sometimes thickening so that she could see only a few steps ahead, sometimes thinning to reveal glimpses of the magnificent mountain landscape that surrounded her. Through the shifting veils of vapor, she could see towering peaks that stretched up toward the sky, their summits lost in clouds that seemed to touch the realm of the gods themselves. As the afternoon progressed and she worked her way higher up the mountain, Astrid found herself entering a landscape that seemed to exist beyond the normal boundaries of the physical world. The air here was so thin and pure that each breath seemed to fill her lungs with liquid light, and the silence was so profound that she could hear the beating of her own heart as clearly as if it were a drum echoing through the peaks. The mist at this elevation moved in ways that defied ordinary understanding, sometimes flowing upward like inverted waterfalls, other times spreading horizontally through the air like ghostly rivers. It seemed to respond to forces beyond mere wind and temperature, as if it were guided by some intelligence that understood the sacred nature of this high place. The path she followed had now become little more than a series of natural stepping stones, each one placed by the mountain itself in exactly the right position to guide travelers safely through the increasingly ethereal landscape. Between these stones, the ground was covered with a carpet of the finest moss she had ever seen, so soft and delicate that it seemed to be woven from green silk. As she climbed higher still, Astrid began to notice that the quality of light around her was changing in subtle but profound ways. Even filtered through the mist, the sunlight seemed more intense and concentrated, as if the thin air allowed its full power to shine through without obstruction. This light had a cleansing effect on everything it touched, making the colors of the herbs and mosses more vivid and the shapes of the rocks more clearly defined. In this realm of purified light and rarefied air, Astrid discovered herbs that existed nowhere else in the world. These were plants that seemed to feed not just on soil and water, but on light itself and the essence of the high mountain atmosphere. Their leaves were so translucent that the light seemed to pass through them completely, and their flowers were colors that she had no names for, hues that seemed to exist at the very edge of human perception. One plant in particular drew her attention, a small herb that, as she carefully harvested a few leaves from this extraordinary plant, Astrid felt a sensation unlike anything she had ever experienced. It was as if a gentle current of pure energy were flowing up through her hands and arms, filling her entire body with a sense of lightness and clarity. The world around her seemed to become more vivid and alive, and she had the impression that she could see not just the physical forms of the plants and stones, but their inner essences as well. The wind at this elevation had its own unique character, different from the breezes of the lower slopes. It moved in patterns that seemed almost choreographed, flowing around the peaks and through the valleys in spirals and currents that created a constant, gentle music. This wind carried with it not just the scents of snow and stone, but also something more intangible, something that spoke of vast distances and infinite possibilities. As she worked among the star-touched herbs, Astrid became aware that she was no longer alone in this high sanctuary. Though she saw no physical forms, she could sense the presence of others who had made this pilgrimage over the centuries. The spirits of healers and wisdom keepers seemed to move through the mist around her. Their presence felt rather than seen, offering guidance and blessing to her work. These invisible companions seemed to whisper advice on which herbs to choose and how to harvest them with the greatest respect and effectiveness. Sometimes she would feel a gentle touch on her shoulder, guiding her attention to a plant she might otherwise have overlooked. Other times, she would hear what sounded like distant voices carried on the wind, speaking words of encouragement and wisdom in languages that were ancient when her grandmother's grandmother was young. The mist itself seemed to be alive with these presences, swirling and dancing in patterns that suggested forms and faces just at the edge of recognition. It was not frightening, but rather deeply comforting, as if she were being welcomed into a community of healers that transcended the boundaries of time and mortality. As the afternoon light began to take on the golden quality that spoke of approaching evening, Astrid found herself drawn toward what appeared to be the highest accessible point of the mountain. The path here was barely visible, marked only by the occasional cairn and the subtle wearing of the granite by countless careful footsteps over the millennia. Final approach to the summit required all of her attention and care. The path wound between towering columns of stone that had been carved by wind and weather into shapes of surreal beauty. Some resembled the pillars of a vast natural cathedral. Others looked like frozen waterfalls of stone that had been caught in the moment of their falling and transformed into eternal sculptures. Between these stone formations, the mist moved in patterns that seemed almost deliberate, as if it were performing some ancient dance of welcome for those brave enough to make the complete journey to the summit. Sometimes it would part completely, revealing breathtaking vistas of the world spread out below. Other times, it would close in protectively, creating an intimate cocoon of solitude and peace. The herbs that grew in this highest realm were the rarest and most potent of all. They existed in tiny, isolated communities, each plant separated from its neighbors by distances that would be insignificant at sea level, but represented major journeys in this landscape of vertical stone and swirling mist. These plants had adapted to conditions so extreme that they seemed to exist at the very edge of what life could achieve. Each herb she found at this elevation was a treasure beyond price, a concentration of healing power that had been refined and purified by its struggle to survive in this realm between earth and sky. The leaves were small and thick, designed to conserve every drop of moisture and every ray of sunlight. Their colors were muted, but incredibly pure, as if all unnecessary elements had been stripped away to reveal the essential nature of the plant itself. As she harvested these precious herbs, Astrid felt a profound sense of completion, as if her journey had brought her to exactly the place she was meant to be. The physical effort of the climb, the careful attention required for proper harvesting, and the spiritual significance of the work had combined to create an experience that was transforming her on levels she was only beginning to understand. The wind at this height carried with it the voices of all the peaks around her, a chorus of stone and ice and sky that spoke of the fundamental forces that shaped the world. It was a song without words, but full of meaning, a communication that bypassed the mind and spoke directly to the soul. As she approached what appeared to be the very summit of her journey, Astrid found herself standing at the edge of a natural platform of smooth granite that jutted out into the mist-filled air. This platform was perhaps 20 paces across, perfectly flat and circular, as if it had been carved by the hands of giants, specifically for the purpose of providing a sacred space for ceremonies and contemplation. The mist here moved in slow, majestic circles around the platform, sometimes rising to create walls of white vapor that blocked all view of the world beyond. Other times sinking down to reveal vistas of such breathtaking beauty that they seemed to belong to another world entirely. From this vantage point, she could see mountain ranges stretching to the horizon in every direction, peak after peak rising like waves in a sea of stone and sky. But it was not just the physical beauty of the view that made this place so extraordinary. There was something in the quality of the silence, the purity of the air, and the way the light fell through the mist that spoke of sacred power. This was clearly a place where the boundary between the mortal world and the realm of the divine had been worn thin by countless generations of reverent visitors. In the center of the platform, Astrid discovered a natural depression in the granite that had been filled by centuries. Around this sacred pool grew herbs unlike any she had seen, even in the hidden valley of eternal springs. These plants seemed to exist in a realm beyond ordinary botany, their forms suggesting rather than depicting the familiar shapes of leaves and flowers. They pulsed gently with their own inner light, and when the wind stirred them, they produced harmonies that seemed to resonate not just in the air, but in the very stones of the mountain itself. These were the herbs spoken of in the most ancient songs, the plants that grew only in places where mortals could come closest to touching the realm of the gods. They were said to have the power to heal any wound, cure any illness, and restore balance to any system that had fallen into discord. More importantly, they could provide the wisdom needed to use all healing power responsibly and with proper reverence for the sacred nature of life itself. As she knelt beside the sacred pool to harvest these most precious of all herbs, Astrid felt the presence of all those who had come before her more strongly than ever. The platform seemed crowded with invisible witnesses, generations of healers and wisdom keepers who had made this same pilgrimage and performed this same sacred work. She could feel their approval and blessing as she worked, their accumulated wisdom guiding her hands to select exactly the right plants in exactly the right way. The harvesting was performed not just with her physical senses, but with intuitive knowledge that seemed to flow to her from the mountain itself and from the long line of healers whose footsteps had worn this path smooth over the centuries. The water from the sacred pool was different from any she had encountered before. When she cupped it in her hands, it seemed to have no weight at all, as if it were made of liquid light rather than ordinary matter. When she brought it to her lips, it had no taste in the conventional sense, but rather a quality that seemed to cleanse and purify every cell in her body. This water would be saved for the most sacred of healing ceremonies, used only in cases where ordinary remedies had failed and divine intervention was needed. Even a few drops added to other preparations would transform them, multiplying their healing power beyond all normal expectations. In this place of ultimate peace and healing power, Astrid felt her journey reaching its perfect completion. Her basket was now heavy with the most precious healing herbs that existed anywhere in the world, each one carefully selected and blessed with gratitude. But more importantly, she had been transformed by the journey itself, filled with new wisdom and deeper understanding of the sacred relationship between healer and patient, between human beings and the natural world that sustained them. The spirits of the mountain seemed to whisper their approval as she sat in quiet meditation beside the sacred pool. The wind carried their blessings down from the highest peaks, and the mist wrapped around her like a gentle embrace from the divine forces that governed all healing work. As Chapter 3 draws toward its peaceful conclusion, Astrid prepares to begin her gentle descent from the summit of Whispering Winds, carrying with her not just the physical treasures she has gathered, but the spiritual insights that will guide her healing work for the rest of her life. The mountain has shared its deepest secrets with her, and she has proven herself worthy of the trust placed in her by countless generations of healers who walked this path before her. The mist parts gently before her as she rises to begin the journey home, and the wind carries her downward on currents of blessing and peace, while the sacred herbs in her basket pulsed gently with the concentrated healing power of the high places where earth and sky become one. Soon, she will return to her village below, where those who need healing wait for her return. But she will carry with her always the memory of this perfect day among the peaks, and the whispered songs of the mountain winds that speak of eternal peace and boundless love for all living things. And so our gentle Viking herb gatherer completes her mystical journey through the Misty Mountains, her heart at peace and her spirit renewed by communion with the ancient healing powers that flow through the high places of the world, carrying their blessings down to those who wait in the valleys below for her return with the precious gifts of mountain wisdom and celestial healing herbs that will restore both body and soul to perfect balance and harmony. Morning progressed. Astrid followed a network of small paths that crisscrossed the mountainside like the threads of an enormous tapestry. Each path had been created over generations by the feet of herb gatherers, healers, and mountain wanderers who had come before her. The paths were narrow but well defined, marked here and there by small cairns of stacked stones that served as guideposts for those who knew how to read their ancient language. She came upon a series of small terraces, natural ledges in the mountainside where the soil was particularly rich and the growing conditions perfect for the rarest of healing plants. Here, protected from the wind by towering rock formations and nourished by the constant mist, grew herbs that could heal wounds that would not close, calm fevers that would not break, and bring rest to minds that could not find peace. One plant in particular caught her attention, a small, delicate herb with leaves that seemed to shimmer with their own inner light. Her grandmother had called this plant sleep's gentle friend, and it was perhaps the most precious of all the mountain's gifts. When prepared correctly, it could bring the deepest, most restful sleep to those who suffered from endless wakefulness, allowing their bodies and minds to heal in the blessed realm of dreams. As she carefully harvested a few sprigs of this precious herb, Astrid heard the sound of falling water growing stronger. Following the sound through a narrow passage between two moss-covered boulders, she emerged into a hidden amphitheatre carved by centuries of flowing water. At the far end of this natural sanctuary, a waterfall tumbled down from a height that disappeared into the mist above. The waterfall was not the thundering cascade of the great rivers, but rather a gentle, steady flow that fell like a curtain of liquid silver into a pool of the clearest water imaginable. The pool was surrounded by smooth stones, worn round by countless years of patient water, and the edges were lined with the softest moss that seemed to glow with an inner green light. The sound of the falling water was hypnotic, a steady rhythm that seemed to match the slow beating of a peaceful heart. Astrid sat on one of the moss-covered stones beside the pool and closed her eyes, allowing the sound to wash over her like a benediction. The mist from the waterfall created a cool, refreshing atmosphere, and she could feel tiny droplets settling on her face like the gentlest kisses of the mountain spirits. In this peaceful sanctuary, time seemed to slow and stretch. The concerns of the village, the daily tasks that awaited her return, all seemed to fade away in the presence of such natural beauty. Here, Surrounded by the quiet majesty of the mountains, Astrid felt connected to something larger than herself, to the endless cycle of seasons and growth, death and renewal that governed all life. The pool beside the waterfall was home to plants that grew nowhere else, herbs that required the constant mist and the pure water to thrive. These were perhaps the most potent of all healing plants, capable of mending not just the body, but the spirit as well. Astrid had seen her grandmother use these herbs to help warriors find peace after battle, to comfort mothers who grieved for lost children, and to bring hope to those who had lost their way in the darkness of despair. She worked slowly and methodically, selecting each plant with the wisdom that had been passed down through generations of healers. The water plants required special care, their roots delicate and their leaves easily bruised. She used a small curved knife made from bone to cut the stems cleanly, and wrapped each plant in damp linen to keep it fresh during the journey home. As she worked, Astrid became aware of the subtle sounds of mountain life around her. The soft splash of water over stones, the gentle rustle of leaves in the mountain breeze, the distant call of a bird whose song seemed to echo off the high peaks. Occasionally, she would hear the soft footfall of some small mountain creature moving through the undergrowth. But these sounds never startled or alarmed her. The mountains were her home, and all the creatures that dwelt here were her neighbors and companions. The mist continued to ebb and flow around the hidden amphitheater like a living thing, sometimes revealing distant peaks and valleys, sometimes closing in to create an intimate cocoon of peace and solitude. In the changing light filtered through the mist, the waterfall seemed to take on different aspects, sometimes appearing like a column of pure light, sometimes like a curtain of the finest silk that trembled in the mountain breeze. Astrid filled her water flask from the pool, knowing that this pure mountain water had healing properties of its own. The water was so cold that it made her teeth ache. But it was the good kind of cold, the kind that spoke of deep, clean sources and untouched wilderness. She would save this water for the preparation of her most delicate herbal remedies, knowing that its purity would enhance their healing power. As the morning wore on, the mist began to lift slightly, revealing more of the magnificent landscape that surrounded her. Through breaks in the white veil, she could see rolling hills covered in a carpet of green that stretched to the horizon, dotted here and there with groves of trees and the silver threads of streams making their way down to the fjords below. The higher peaks remained shrouded in clouds, their summits lost in a realm that seemed to belong more to the gods than to mortals. These were the ancient mountains, the bones of the earth itself, worn smooth by countless ages of wind and weather. They had watched over her people since the beginning of time, offering protection from storms and providing the pure water and healing herbs that sustained life in the valleys below. Astrid found herself thinking of her grandmother as she worked, remembering the countless times they had made this journey together when she was a young girl. Her grandmother had moved with the same careful reverence, the same deep respect for the gifts of the mountain. She had taught Astrid not just which plants to gather and how to prepare them, but more importantly, how to approach the work of healing with humility and grace. The mountains give freely to those who ask with respect, her grandmother had always said. But they can sense greed and haste in the human heart, and they will hide their treasures from those who would take more than they need or use their gifts for selfish purposes. This wisdom guided every movement of Astrid's hands as she continued her gathering. She took only what was needed, never more than the plants could spare. And always with a word of gratitude and a promise to use the gifts wisely. In return, the mountain seemed to reveal more of its secrets to her, showing her hidden groves where the rarest herbs grew, and guiding her feet along paths that others might never find. The sound of her own breathing seemed to harmonize with the rhythm of the waterfall, creating a peaceful meditation that calmed her mind and centered her spirit. This was the true gift of the mountain gathering, not just the herbs themselves, but the peace and clarity that came from spending time in such a sacred place. As she prepared to leave the hidden amphitheater, Astrid took one last look around, memorizing every detail of this perfect sanctuary. The way the mist swirled around the base of the waterfall, the particular shade of green of the moss that covered the stones, the sound of water falling like gentle music in the mountain air. These memories would sustain her through the long winter months, when the mountains were locked in snow and ice, reminding her that beneath the cold and darkness, the spring herbs were already dreaming of their time to grow. She shouldered her basket, now heavy with the day's gathering, and made her way back through the narrow passage between the boulders. The path that led onward and upward beckoned to her, promising more treasures hidden in the mist-shrouded peaks above. But she moved without haste, knowing that the mountain would reveal its gifts in their own time, and that patience was the greatest virtue a healer could possess. The mist seemed to part before her as she walked, as if the mountain spirits were clearing her way and blessing her journey. Behind her, the sound of the waterfall grew fainter, but never completely disappeared, becoming a memory of peace that would remain with her always. As Chapter 1 of Astrid's peaceful journey draws to a close, she continues upward into the misty peaks, her heart filled with gratitude and her basket heavy with the mountain's generous gifts. The gentle rhythm of her footsteps on the moss-covered path creates a soothing cadence that matches the quiet beating of her peaceful heart, while the soft mountain breeze carries her forward into the welcoming arms of the ancient peaks. The morning mist swirls around her like a blessing, and somewhere in the distance, the sound of flowing water continues its eternal song, promising more wonders and healing herbs waiting to be discovered in the chapters of her journey that lie ahead. As Astrid continued her gentle ascent through the mist-wrapped mountains, the path began to wind through a landscape that seemed touched by magic itself. The morning sun, now higher in the sky, filtered through the ever-present mist in beams of golden light that illuminated droplets of water clinging to every surface, creating millions of tiny rainbows that danced and shimmered in the mountain air. The path she followed had grown narrower but more distinct, worn smooth by centuries of careful footsteps. Here and there she noticed small offerings left by previous travelers, simple gifts of gratitude to the mountain spirits. a perfectly round stone placed carefully on a fallen log, a small bundle of wildflowers tucked into the crook of a tree branch, a few grains of precious salt scattered on a moss-covered boulder. These humble tokens spoke of a tradition as old as the mountains themselves. A recognition that some places in the world were sacred and deserving of respect. As she walked, Astrid became increasingly aware of the subtle changes in the vegetation around her. The hardy mountain pines were giving way to trees she recognized as ancient varieties, species that grew only in the most protected and mystical places of the high country. Their bark was silver white, smooth as silk to the touch, and their leaves whispered secrets in languages that seemed older than human memory. The moss beneath her feet had grown even thicker and more luxurious, creating a carpet so soft and yielding that her steps made no sound at all. The silence was profound, but not empty, filled instead with the gentle music of distant water and the soft susurrus of mist moving through the trees. It was the kind of silence that welcomed contemplation and invited the soul to rest. Following a bend in the path that curved around a massive boulder covered in lichen of the palest green, Astrid found herself standing at the edge of what could only be described as an enchanted valley. The mist here was lighter, more translucent, allowing her to see into a bowl-shaped depression in the mountainside that seemed to exist in its own peaceful world. The valley was not large, perhaps no more than a few hundred paces across. But it was perfect in its proportions and breathtaking in its beauty. The walls of the valley rose gently on all sides, covered in the same silver-barked trees and carpeted with moss of such vibrant green that it seemed to glow with its own inner light. But what made this place truly magical was the presence of not one, but dozens of natural springs that bubbled up from the earth at various points throughout the valley floor. Each spring was different, some emerging as gentle seeps that barely disturbed the moss around them, others bubbling up with enough force to create small pools of the clearest water imaginable. The springs were connected by tiny streams that wandered through the valley in lazy curves, their banks lined with the most extraordinary collection of healing herbs Astrid had ever seen in one place. She made her way carefully down into the valley, following a path that seemed to have been worn by the feet of countless herb gatherers over the centuries. As she descended, the air grew warmer and more humid, filled with the scent of growing things and the mineral-rich aroma of spring water. The mist here took on an almost luminous quality, as if it were infused with the same life-giving properties as the springs themselves. The first spring she approached was no larger than a cooking pot, but the water that bubbled up from its depths was unlike anything she had ever seen. It was so clear that it seemed to have no substance at all, like liquid crystal that caught and reflected the filtered sunlight in patterns that hurt the eyes with their beauty. Around the edge of this spring grew herbs that her grandmother had spoken of only in whispers. Plants that were said to have the power to heal not just the body, but the very essence of a person's being. Astrid knelt beside the spring and cupped a small amount of the water in her hands. It was warm to the touch, heated by the deep fires of the earth. And when she brought it to her lips, she could taste minerals and trace elements that spoke of deep places and ancient stones. The water seemed to tingle on her tongue, and she felt a gentle warmth spread through her chest and down into her limbs, as if the very essence of life itself were flowing through her veins. The herbs that grew around this first spring were unlike any in her collection. Their leaves were a deep, rich green, with veins that seemed to pulse with silver light, and when she touched them gently, they released a fragrance that was both soothing and invigorating at the same time. These were the plants that appeared in the oldest stories, the ones that could restore youth to the aged and strength to the weary. Moving deeper into the valley, Astrid discovered that each spring had its own character and its own collection of associated plants. One spring bubbled up with water that was slightly warmer than the others and tinged with the faintest suggestion of blue, like a piece of sky reflected in crystal. Around this spring grew herbs with flowers of the palest lavender, plants that her grandmother had said could ease the deepest sorrows and bring peace to hearts that had forgotten how to hope. Another spring emerged from between two rounded stones, its water so cold that it seemed to carry the essence of winter itself. But this was not the harsh cold of the killing frost, but rather the clean, pure cold of mountain snow and starlit nights. The plants that thrived in the mist of this spring were silvery white, their leaves covered with fine hairs that caught the moisture from the air and held it like jewels. The mist that filled the valley seemed to move with a purpose of its own, sometimes thickening around her as she worked, creating an intimate cocoon of privacy and concentration. At other times, it would thin to reveal breathtaking vistas of the springs and streams, the silver trees and the moss-covered valley walls that rose gently on all sides. As she worked, Astrid became aware of a subtle music that seemed to emerge from the valley itself. It was not quite the sound of flowing water, though that was part of it, and not quite the whisper of wind through leaves, though that too played its part. Instead, it was something deeper and more fundamental, the very song of the earth itself as it breathed and pulsed with life. The music seemed to harmonize with her own heartbeat, creating a rhythm that was both soothing and energizing. As she moved from spring to spring, the melody seemed to guide her steps, leading her to exactly the right herbs at exactly the right time. It was as if the valley itself were teaching her, sharing its ancient wisdom through the medium of sound and sensation. Near the center of the valley, Astrid discovered the largest of the springs. A pool, perhaps 10 paces across, that bubbled up from depths that seemed to reach toward the very core of the mountain. The water in this central spring was different from all the others, possessing a clarity that seemed to transcend the physical world entirely. Looking into its depths was like gazing into liquid light, and she had the strange sensation that if she looked long enough, she might see visions of times past and future reflected in its pristine surface. The herbs that grew around this central spring were the most magnificent of all, plants that seemed to embody every healing property known to her tradition. and many that were beyond her current understanding. Their leaves were large and perfect, their flowers radiant with colours that seemed too pure and intense to be entirely natural. These were the herbs that appeared in the most sacred stories, the ones that could heal any wound, cure any illness, and restore balance to any system that had fallen into discord. As she worked around the central spring, Astrid felt a profound sense of connection to all the healers who had come before her. She could almost feel their presence in the valley. The spirits of countless wise women and men who had made this pilgrimage over the centuries, each one adding their own reverence and gratitude to the accumulated sanctity of the place. The water from the central spring was too precious to waste, and Astrid used her smallest vessels to collect samples that she would save for the most critical healing work. Each drop seemed to contain the concentrated essence of the mountain's power, and she knew that even tiny amounts of this water could enhance the potency of her herbal preparations beyond measure. The mist that rose from the warm springs created a microclimate within the valley that was unlike anywhere else in the mountains. The air was soft and humid, filled with negative ions that seemed to cleanse not just the lungs, but the very thoughts themselves. Breathing this air was like drinking peace itself, and Astrid felt her mind becoming clearer and more focused with each breath. As the day progressed, she noticed that the light within the valley had a quality unlike that of the outside world. Even filtered through layers of mist, it seemed more golden, more alive, as if the sun itself were somehow enhanced by its passage through this sacred space. The light played constantly through the rising mist, creating patterns and shapes that seemed almost like a visual language, a form of communication from the mountain spirits themselves. The plants she gathered in this valley were unlike any in her previous experience. They seemed to pulse with their own inner light, and their healing properties were so concentrated that she knew even the smallest amounts would be incredibly potent. She wrapped each specimen with extra care, using her finest linen cloths and taking special precautions to preserve their vital essence during the journey home. Working in such a concentrated field of healing energy was both exhilarating and exhausting. Astrid found herself needing to take frequent rest breaks, not because of physical fatigue, but because her sensitivity to the plant's energies was being heightened beyond her normal experience. During these rest periods, she would sit quietly beside one of the springs, allowing the sound of the bubbling water and the gentle music of the valley to restore her equilibrium. During one such rest period, seated beside the central spring on a natural bench of moss-covered stone, Astrid found herself slipping into a state of deep meditation. The boundaries between herself and the valley seemed to dissolve, and she experienced a profound sense of unity with the healing forces that flowed through this sacred place. In this state of expanded awareness, she began to understand the deeper mysteries of her healing tradition, insights that could not be taught but could only be experienced in places of such concentrated power. When she finally emerged from this meditative state, the light in the valley had shifted, indicating that several hours had passed without her awareness. But rather than feeling disoriented, she felt more grounded and centered than ever before. The springs continued their eternal bubbling, the mist continued its gentle dance, and the healing herbs continued to grow in perfect abundance, all exactly as they had been, and as they would continue to be long after she was gone. The realization of the valley's timeless nature filled Astrid with a deep sense of peace and continuity. She was not just gathering herbs for her own time and place, but participating in an ancient cycle of healing that stretched backward and forward through the generations. The herbs she gathered today would heal bodies and spirits in her own time, but they were also part of a larger pattern of healing that encompassed all times and all people. As the afternoon mist began to shift and change, revealing different aspects of the valley's beauty, Astrid prepared to continue her journey. Her basket was now heavy with the most precious healing herbs imaginable, each one carefully wrapped and blessed with gratitude. But she knew that the true treasure of the valley was not the physical plants themselves, but the deeper understanding of healing that she had gained through her time in this sacred place. The springs would continue to flow, the mist would continue to rise, and the healing herbs would continue to grow long after she had returned to her village. But she would carry the memory of this perfect valley with her always. And in times of doubt or difficulty, she would remember the sound of eternal springs and the sight of mist rising like prayers into the mountain air. As she made her way toward the gentle slope that led up and out of the valley, Astrid paused for one last look at the springs and streams, the silver trees and the moss-covered walls that had sheltered her work. The mist was beginning to thicken again, slowly veiling the valley's treasures from casual view. But she knew that the sanctuary would always be there, waiting patiently for the next seeker of healing wisdom to find their way down the hidden path. The sound of bubbling springs followed her as she climbed up and out of the valley, gradually fading but never completely disappearing, becoming instead a memory of perfect peace that would sustain her through all the challenges that lay ahead. And as Chapter 2 of her journey draws to its peaceful close, Astrid carries with her not just a collection of healing herbs, but a renewed understanding of her place in the ancient tradition of mountain healing that connects her to all times and all healers, past, present, and future. The mist parts gently before her feet as she continues upward into the high peaks, where even greater wonders await discovery in the misty realm where earth touches sky. As Astrid emerged from the hidden valley of eternal springs, the path before her began to climb more steeply, winding its way through landscapes that seemed to exist at the very threshold between the earthly realm and the domain of the sky itself. The mist here was different, thinner and more ethereal, no longer the thick, enveloping blanket of the lower elevations, but rather wisps and streamers that danced on currents of air so subtle they could barely be felt. The vegetation, too, began to change as she climbed higher. The silver-barked trees of the valley gave way to hardy mountain birches, their trunks twisted and sculpted by years of wind into forms that resembled dancers frozen in motion. These trees grew more sparsely as the elevation increased, each one a testament to the power of life to thrive even in the most challenging conditions. The moss beneath her feet had changed as well, becoming sparser but somehow more vibrant in its colouring. Here it grew in small patches of the most intense emerald green, each clump seeming to glow with concentrated life force. Between these patches of moss, the path was marked by stones that had been worn smooth by countless years of weather, each one polished to a finish that reflected the dancing mist like mirrors. As she climbed, Astrid became aware of a new sound joining the constant music of her mountain journey. It was the sound of wind, but not the harsh, driving wind of storms. Instead, it was a gentle, constant breeze that seemed to carry with it the voices of the high places, a whispered conversation that had been going on since the mountains first rose from the earth. As she continued her ascent, the mist began to take on new properties that fascinated and delighted her. Sometimes it would gather itself into spirals and columns that rose high into the air, like living sculptures, only to dissolve and reform in new patterns moments later. Other times, it would spread itself thin across the landscape, like the finest silk, allowing tantalizing glimpses of the magnificent vistas that lay hidden beyond its veil. Through these brief clearings in the mist, Astrid caught sight of views that took her breath away. Far below, she could see the green valleys where her people lived, now looking like a patchwork quilt spread across the earth. Tiny streams glittered like silver threads in the afternoon light, and she could just make out the small clearing where her own village lay, a cluster of buildings so small they looked like toys from this great height. But it was not just the view downward that amazed her. When the mist cleared in other directions, she could see that she was now among the high peaks themselves, surrounded by summits that rose like great stone cathedrals toward the sky. Some of these peaks were shrouded in their own private clouds, their uppermost reaches lost in realms that seemed to belong more to the heavens than to the earth. The herbs that grew at this elevation were unlike any she had encountered before, plants that seemed to exist at the very edge of what was possible for earthbound life. They grew in small, compact clusters, their leaves thick and waxy to protect them from the intense sunlight and thin air of the high peaks. These were plants that had learned to thrive on the very breath of the wind itself, drawing their sustenance from the mineral-rich moisture that the constant breezes carried from the ice and snow of the highest summits. One particular plant caught her attention, a small silvery herb that grew in perfect spiral patterns on the exposed faces of the weathered granite. Her grandmother had told her stories of this plant, calling it wind's gift, but Astrid had never expected to see it with her own eyes. The plant seemed to shimmer and dance, even when the air was perfectly still, as if it were moved by currents of energy that existed beyond the physical wind. Gathering these high-altitude herbs required even greater care and reverence than any she had shown before. These plants had survived for decades, perhaps centuries, in conditions that would kill most forms of life. Each one was a miracle of adaptation and endurance, and she felt honoured beyond measure to be permitted to harvest even the smallest portions of their healing essence. As she worked, Astrid became increasingly aware of the profound silence that existed at this elevation. It was not the complete absence of sound, for the wind continued its gentle conversation, and the occasional call of a high mountain bird could be heard echoing off the granite walls. Rather, it was a quality of silence that seemed to exist between and beneath all other sounds, a deep quietude that spoke of vast spaces and unlimited time. This silence had a cleansing effect on her thoughts and emotions. The small worries and daily concerns that had seemed so important at lower elevations began to fade away, replaced by a sense of perspective that could only come from standing so close to the sky. Here, surrounded by peaks that had watched the rise and fall of countless generations, the temporary troubles of mortal life seemed less urgent and overwhelming. This luminous mist seemed to have an almost hypnotic effect, creating patterns and shapes that drew the eye and calmed the mind. Sometimes it would form itself into spirals that seemed to beckon her forward. Other times, into flowing ribbons that wrapped around the peaks like celestial scarves. The constantly changing display was more beautiful than any work of art she had ever seen. A masterpiece created anew each moment by the invisible hands of wind and weather. The herbs that grew in this realm of luminous mist were the most ethereal of all. Their leaves seemed almost transparent, shot through with veins that caught the light like fibre drawn from moonbeams. When the wind stirred them, they made a sound like the tinkling of tiny bells, a music so delicate and beautiful that it seemed to come from another world entirely. These were the herbs of which the oldest songs spoke, the plants that could heal not just the body or even the mind, but the very soul itself. They were said to have the power to restore the connection between mortal beings and the divine forces that governed the universe, to remind people of their place in the great pattern of existence that connected all things. Gathering these sacred plants was the most delicate work of all. Astrid had to wait for exactly the right moment, when the wind was still and the mist had cleared just enough to reveal the plants clearly. Even then, she moved with the slowest and most careful motions, taking only tiny portions of each plant and leaving offerings of gratitude in the form of drops of pure spring water from the hidden valley below. As the